We all know that Switzerland was a white neutral spot in the middle of war-torn Europe during the Second World War. But looking at the map, we notice another country that managed to remain neutral until the end of the war, despite being completely surrounded by the Axis powers. We are talking about Sweden. The country is over 13 times the size of Switzerland, is located quite centrally in Scandinavia and has a very long, rather poorly defensible border with its neighbors, which were, after all, in the hands of the enemy. We know that the Germans were quite uninterested in declarations of neutrality. Countries like the Netherlands, Denmark and Norway did as well, and yet it was only a matter of time before they were conquered. So how did Sweden remain neutral until the end of the war? How did it escape conquest by the Germans, and how neutral was Sweden in reality? We'll look at all these questions in today's video. Enjoy! Sweden had a long period of neutrality even before World War II. This went back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars, when Sweden lost a third of its entire territory with Finland. Finland had previously belonged to Sweden for 6 centuries, not as a colony but as a permanent part of the country. And this event burned itself deeply into the Swedish DNA, and the motto of state neutrality developed in its foreign policy. And it more or less maintained this in all subsequent European wars, including the First World War. But the neutrality was soon to be put to a hard test, and again Finland was the trigger. The neighboring country was invaded by the Soviet Union on November 30, 1939, and Sweden feared that it would be the next country to fall victim to Soviet expansion. Moreover, they wanted to support the Finns. Therefore, in the so-called Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland, Sweden did not declare the traditional neutrality, but declared itself a non-belligerent state. Thus, the country supplied numerous military equipment, and a volunteer army of over 8,000 men, the Swedish Corps, intervened in the war. Officially, however, the Swedish government continued to declare itself neutral. And the situation for Sweden became even worse when now, from the other side, also the Germans expanded. In April 1940, the German Reich invaded Denmark and Norway and occupied both states, although they had actually declared their neutrality. So it now seemed only a matter of time before Sweden would be attacked either from the east or from the west, with the main danger coming from the Germans. The government in Stockholm realized that it would have to make concessions as soon as possible in order to preserve its sovereignty. Thus, not only were the requests for help from Norway strictly rejected, but the Germans were actively supported, and that on all levels. Iron ore production was particularly important. This became central for the German weapons production, and the iron ores had to be exported almost completely to Germany from now on. In other respects, Sweden was now completely dependent on Germany, and 90% of its export went there. Later, the Germans even used Sweden as a transit corridor for their troops, which caused particular resentment among the population. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Finland had allied itself with Germany, and now over 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were shipped to Lapland. So Sweden was now completely surrounded by Axis powers, and it had less and less freedom of choice. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary in 1942, "Sweden has done more for the German war effort than is usually assumed. They emphasized their neutrality, but in a way that is to our advantage." And there is another reason why Swedish independence was to the Germans' advantage. Namely, they continued to have a diplomatic mission in Stockholm, which was used as a hub for espionage, war logistics and propaganda. Since Germany was otherwise almost completely cut off from the world, they thus had an arm to the outside world through neutral Sweden. Similar, then, to Switzerland, through which banking transactions were conducted. Historians argue whether Sweden had no choice in real politics but to accept the German conditions, or whether it could have acted more strongly against them. The fact is, however, that Sweden thus escaped German occupation and remained neutral, at least officially, until the end of the war. Many Jews from neighboring countries were able to flee to Sweden, and as Germany began to weaken more and more, exports of the important iron ores were reduced and the Allies were supported. So we can see that Swedish neutrality can be viewed quite critically, even though it has officially existed for more than 200 years now. But last year it came to a sudden end. Sweden declared the end of its neutrality policy in the wake of the Russian war of aggression and has recently become a member of NATO.